Welcome to the Apologist Bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I really like Paul Copan. He's been involved in our apologetics class via Zoom, and just a terrific person. I like him a lot. Good professor, excellent writer. Probably the most famous of his books is True for You, but Not for Me. Subtitled Deflating the Slogans That Leave Christians Speechless. That's really good. There's another one called That's Just Your Interpretation. He's done an in-depth look at the idea of genocide. Was God a master and creator of genocide in the Old Testament? So he's got a book called Is God a Moral Monster? Forgot the title there. So anyway, I want to look at another one of his. Lee Strobel calls it well-reasoned and ultimately persuasive. It's called When God Goes to Starbucks, a guide to everyday apologetics. And the part I want to focus on today, they're very short chapters, so I may do more than one, but it's the first part of his book. It's called Slogans Related to Truth and Reality, things we hear a lot, and then his response as a Christian. So here's number one, chapter 1. Why not just look out for yourself? Ayn Rand said the human basis for morality is self-interest, or egoism. She popularized egoism. It's kind of like do something nice to others so they'll do something nice to you. She says that everybody's got a moral duty to pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. I mean, after all, I'm the one who best knows what I need, much better than any other person. So self-interest comes before the interest of others. That's what the good life is all about, isn't it? Pursuing what I want. And Paul says this view fits really nicely with today's view of true for you, but not for me mentality. These are relativists, and they're not interested in finding truth, just preserving their own autonomy. I think that's a good point. So he says, all right, let's suppose self-interest is your basis for decision-making and coming up with your priorities. He said there are a lot of problems with that, and that's what the rest of the chapter is going to do. And it's only about a 6-page chapter. So like I said, they're pretty short. But I like it. It's just cut to the chase. So why not just look out for yourself? Well, here's some of the problems. One, that view doesn't really distinguish between self-interest and selfishness, does it? So she seems to suggest, Ayn Rand does, that self-sacrifice and self-preservation are opposed to each other. If you're concerned about others, then you're less likely to preserve your own life. But he says that's confused thinking. Taking care of yourself isn't the same as selfishness. A normal self-love means we will feed and take care of our bodies. Paul says no one's ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. So self-love isn't a goal, but it's just a fact, right? The fact that we love ourselves should guide us in the love of others. We know how we want to be treated, so that serves as a model for how to treat others. Here's a second problem with that view. Why not just look out for yourself? Well, this view, he says, commits what he calls the naturalistic fallacy, moving from is to ought. So the problem with her view is that it makes an illegitimate jump from the way we're supposed to be, the way we ought to be, from the way we are. So that's moving from descriptive to prescriptive. Right? So we're self-centered beings. Does that mean that's the way we ought to be? That just means that's human nature. We need to overcome that. Third, what's another problem with just looking out for ourselves? When we speak about how we ought to live, we're speaking of some kind of universally applied ideal, but that flies in the face of egoism, right? Egoism, if it becomes universalized and practiced, it undermines itself. Why? It tells others to live for themselves rather than to live for me. So that's a deficient view. Egoists don't want their views universalized. They should keep quiet about them, he says. Here's a fourth problem. You can never trust an ethical egoist. When they offer moral advice to other people, why? Because what they're going to do, it's going to be to his or her own advantage, isn't it? Not somebody else's to follow it. The egoist is always me deep in conversation. I like that line. So advocates of egoism just create suspicion. If they say, hey, here's what you ought to do, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that's what the person wants me to do because it helps him or her. Here's another problem. Why not just look out for yourself? Well, the egoist's desire to get what he or she wants turns out to be empty. It's trivial. The egoist says that what he wants is the drive to all that he or anyone else does. So it's a problem there. When I decide, what I decide to do is nothing I have control over because all my choices and actions are determined by my strongest desire. Why should I assume that? Wouldn't holding belief in egoism be determined by their deepest desires rather than just rationally choosing it? So he says what's going on here is that people just assume egoism is right rather than offering a good argument for it. And he says, think about this. People may want all sorts of things that are really self-destructive. Here's another problem. Why not just look out for yourself? Even if egoists lay claim to self-interest rather than selfishness, we're left with the problem of arbitrariness. Why only this virtue and no others? Yeah, that's a good point. Seventh, the pursuit of power or self-interest isn't an end in itself. It's a means to something else. But how do you determine that goal? I mean, think about egoism from Friedrich Nietzsche. He called it the will to power. He hated Christianity. He said that was a doormat theology. Everything was about pursuing power. Well, why is that the supreme value? All right, here's another problem with looking out for yourself. Even if I may end up getting some benefit from a charitable act, it doesn't follow that was my motive for acting charitably. Ninth, there's going to inevitably be a conflict of interests or egos. What happens if my interests clash with another's? How do you adjudicate between these personal agendas? That's a good point. 10th, any obligation to self-interest is just a matter of convenience, isn't it, for the egoist? So the moral rules for an egoist is just convenience, right? What works for me. So there's the chapter. Let me just go through these. He has a summary at the end of each chapter. And maybe I'll skip that because of time, but take a look at them. They're really good. Okay, so let's go to chapter 2. Here's a big one. Do what you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. He starts with a reference to Jack Kevorkian. Remember him? Dr. Death? Planned suicide, planned death. He's euthanized or assisted in the suicides of more than 100 people. He was asked about his philosophical beliefs. So Copan has a quote from him. He said, yeah, it's quite simple. Absolute personal autonomy. I'm an absolute autonomist. Do and say whatever you want to do and say it any time you want to do or say it as long as you don't harm or threaten anybody else's person or property. And that statement got a lot of applause. He says, well, so Copan says, what about that? Remember, it says at the end of that statement, do what you want, just as long as you don't hurt anyone. So he says, let's look at that qualifier, just as long as you don't hurt anyone. So Copan responds to that first. He says, it's an irony, he says, that people that deny moral standards in our society, but then they slip in another standard in the back door when no one seems to be looking. So people make these relativistic claims, oh, there's no truth, or that's just your truth. But then they put something absolute at the end there. People can do whatever they want, just as long as they don't hurt anyone. Or this, you can do whatever you want, as long as it's between two consenting adults. You notice how they're starting to put a absolute in there? Or how about this one? You can do whatever you want, as long as it's in the privacy of your own home. Or people can believe and do whatever they want. They should just be tolerant of others. So in essence, what are these people saying? You don't have any limits whatsoever. Well, except for this one or that one. I think that's a really good point. Here's a second problem with just as long as you don't hurt anyone. He says, if you look at that slogan, it ends up self-destructing. If it's a purely autonomous world, why do we insist on any standards at all? Why be concerned about others? People can do whatever they want, just as long as they don't hurt anyone. He says, but what's wrong with hurting another person if you can get away with it? That's a good point. If we're just evolved animals, do what you want as long as it's between two consenting adults. Well, what if the two consenting adults are doing sadomasochistic acts? Aren't such actions deviant? Shouldn't we maybe lower the age of sexual consent? That's what the North American man-boy love wants. So I think that's a really good point there. Third, one can do a number of things without, quote, hurting others, but they'd still be wrong and should be avoided. I mean, think about date rape drugs. Do what you want without hurting anybody. So a young man wants to do what he wants. The woman at the party puts a drug in her drink. He says, you can guess the rest. Maybe he takes precautions. So there are no consequences. He's violated her, but he didn't hurt her, even without her knowing what took place. Can he do whatever he wants? He didn't really hurt her. But Copan says, we recognize this is intolerable. He didn't hurt the woman physically or even psychologically, but he took advantage of her. So we know that certain things are wrong, even if they don't injure another person. Here's another example of that. Do what you want, just as long as you don't hurt anyone. So how about this? Mocking mental hospital patients whose minds are no longer connected to reality. Saying hateful things to them. That doesn't hurt them because they don't know what's going on. But that's wrong. What if a teenager wants to commit suicide? Isn't that his autonomy? Wouldn't we say that's a good thing? No. Here's another argument against the just as long as you don't hurt anyone. Human freedom and choices are important, but they got to be considered in the context of something bigger like community and the fact that life is a gift and the existence of moral standards. I think that's really good to know. Here's another reason to reject this thing about as long as you don't hurt anybody. Our lives are a gift from God. They're not a right. It's one thing to let a dying person die when all the organs are shutting down since death is coming to us all, but it's something else to intentionally take an innocent person's life, even if they want to die. We always ought to care, even if we can't cure, right? Our lives are a gift from God. So that's a reaction to Kevorkian again. Here's another one. Fifth, freedom is not an end in itself, and it can often be coercive. So we're not free, right? The idea of freedom, we're not free to rape, murder, or steal. We have to know what the freedom is for. So he says at the end here, people that are these absolute autonomous tend not to be interested in being logical. They're committed to their own personal programs. I think that's a really good point. Okay, so that's the second chapter. Let me skip one chapter here. I'm going to go to chapter 4. There's one that I will leave out. Yeah, I like this one. This is, why is God so arrogant, right? So we're finished with the slogan part. Why is God so arrogant and egotistical? You ever heard that one? God's always demanding worship, always talking about how great he is. Some woman asked Paul Copan during a meeting, why does God tell us to worship, praise, and glorify him? It sounds so vain and conceited. Why is it wrong to us, but not God, to be proud? Yeah, so to many people, God seems to be arrogant. He says, maybe we should start by being clear of what pride is. Pride is an inflated view of yourself, and humility is an appropriate acknowledgement and being realistic about who you are. So you start off, God is proud, he's vain. Well, how do you define pride? Pride is really a lie about who you are, isn't it? It's a falsehood. So humility, he says, on the other hand, is being realistic. So when you take a look a little more closely, God can't be called proud. He has a realistic view of himself. It's not false. It's not exaggerated. He's God. You can't ascribe too much greatness to God. He's the greatest conceivable being. He doesn't take more credit than he deserves. Here's another thing. Is God arrogant and egotistical? He says, second, Jesus' call for his followers to be humble is not inconsistent with other concerns to allow our deeds of love to be noted by others. So we're supposed to let our light shine. Jesus assumes his disciples are going to be engaged in corporate prayer, and he tells his disciples to let your light shine like a city on a hill. Jesus prays in public. So he said over and over, Jesus and the rest of the New Testament offer an exhortation against pride. Show when tempted to hide, and hide when tempted to show, he says. So show when tempted to hide, that's Matthew 5:13. And hide when tempted to show, that's Matthew 6:1. So sometimes we stifle doing the right thing in front of others. That's pride. That's the time we should demonstrate commitment to Christ, an act of humility. But he says at other times we may feel like advertising our religious commitment. That is pride, but we ought to keep that secret. Okay, why is God so arrogant and egotistical? God's making us in his image isn't a mark of pride. It's a gift. He bestowed that on us, and we should receive it gratefully. I mean, how amazing is that? We're made in God's image and can receive his salvation. That's God's kindness. That's not arrogance. God created us so that we could rule the world with him and walk with him and worship with him. Being made in God's image as priest kings makes us able to relate to him. Amazing. That's not arrogant. God's not a toy maker creating dolls that look just like him. Yeah, I think that's really good. Somebody said you can think of it this way. By making us in his image, God is spreading the wealth. That God's goodness overflows to his creation. So that's a nice way to think about it. Here's another one. Another remark here about, is God arrogant and egotistical? He says, no. Worshiping God doesn't diminish us, right? It doesn't make us worms. It fulfills us. If we're worshiping God, that's to realize our very purpose, to have a relationship with God. And such worship reflects our place in the universe. We are creatures, and God is the creator. So worship, says, actually comes from an Old English word, worthship, is an appropriate recognition of who God is and our relationship. It's just, for a while at least, forgetting who we are and remembering who God is. So when God calls for our worship, he's not manifesting pride. That's the greatest possible good, right? It's a lofty, lifelong endeavor to be connected with God in worship. It expands our minds. It enriches our soul. It makes us wise, enables us to have a proper self-understanding. That's the highest human pursuit possible. The loving and creating triune God is worthy of our allegiance, our love, and our attention. I think that's a really good point. So God calls us for worship, not because he thinks more highly of himself than he ought to, or he's got false beliefs about himself. Why does he want us to know about him? Because he is in touch with reality. He wants us to know about him because he is reality. Here's another comment. Why is God arrogant? Is he? No. God's jealousy is aroused when human beings turn creatures or false ideas into God's substitutes. See, I think that's a really good point. Just like a woman would not want to share her husband with somebody else, God is jealous, and not in a crazy way, but he's jealous to protect the love relationship that we were all designed to have with him. We always think of jealousy in negative terms, smacks of insecurity. But he said there's an appropriate kind of jealousy, though. So just imagine a wife who isn't concerned at all when another woman flirts with her husband. If she wasn't jealous, we would see her lack of concern as warped and morally deficient. Okay, here's another comment. Is God arrogant and egotistical? No, he says. When the scriptures tell us to praise God, God's not the one commanding praise. It comes from the creatures. I mean, think about all the Psalms, right? David is telling us we should do that. It says, praise is not commanded by God. It's called for by creatures. Praise comes from the creatures. So that's a good thing to think about. Think about the book of Psalms. Okay, let's go on with a couple of other things he brings up. Copan says the triune God is actually humble in himself. How do we see that? In Jesus. He manifested his humility in interacting with us. I mean, Jesus is an example of God who came to serve us. Unbelievable. And of course, he's loving within the relationship of the Trinity as well. So think about the incarnation and death of Jesus. Yeah, especially Philippians. Talks about how he, in Philippians 2, he's humbled himself. He emptied himself, became a slave, died in all sorts of shame and humiliation. Is God arrogant and egotistical? No. Another reason Copan says no. The ultimate picture of divine humility is the humiliation and the degrading death of Jesus on the cross. That's the most glorious achievement. One time Copan said he was speaking with a Muslim friend, Abdul, and he expressed his difficulty. God becoming a man, dying on the cross, he said, it's such a humiliation. Well, that's exactly what it is. For the Muslim, God is so far out there, so transcendent, he wouldn't stoop to the level of us. But look at the God in the New Testament. He sits down at table with the undesirables and outcasts. Yeah, thank goodness, huh? Well, that wraps up pretty much Copan for 3 chapters. We'll do some more of his later, but it's called When God Goes to Starbucks, a really good guide to apologetics. So the book, I guess I didn't tell you the organization of the book. Let me do that real fast and we'll end. So the first section was slogans. Second section we just started in, talking about worldviews. The third section, slogans relating to Christianity. Things like, was Jesus mistaken about an early second coming? That's a good one. So we'll get to those. He talks about gay people. He talks about miracles. He talks about hateful, vindictive things in the book of Psalms, the Bible's holy wars. So we'll spend more time in this book. Excellent book. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast today. Take care, and hope things are going well for you.